You know, what really stops the entire global financial system from just falling apart like it almost did in 2008? Well, it's not luck. It's basically a single shared rulebook that gets written in a quiet city in Switzerland called Basel. Today, we're going to dive into the story of the Basel Accords, the rules that are constantly being updated to keep our money and the whole system safe. So, right off the bat, you might be asking, why Basel? Why do massive banks from New York to Tokyo all have to follow the same script? Well, it's because in the hyper-connected world we live in, one bank's big mistake can set off a global domino effect. This shared rulebook, it's our main line of defense.
All right, so to really get how we got here, we're going on a bit of a journey. We'll start back in the financial Wild West. Then we'll see the first real safety net get built. We'll watch it get a whole lot more sophisticated, see it get tested by the biggest crisis in a generation, and finally take a look at where the rules are heading next.
Okay, let's go back in time. We're talking about the financial Wild West. Before the 1980s, there was really no global standard for how safe a bank had to be. After a system called Bretton Woods collapsed, currencies and interest rates started swinging like crazy, and, well, international finance suddenly became a much more dangerous game.
Just imagine it. You've got banks in one country playing it super safe, while banks in another are taking massive risks. It created this totally uneven playing field and, frankly, a dangerously fragile global system. It became pretty clear that everyone needed to start speaking the same language when it came to risk.
So out of this growing chaos, regulators from the world's biggest economies got together in Basel and came up with a plan. This was the first real, honest-to-goodness attempt to create a global standard for how much risk banks could and should be taking on.
This timeline right here is basically our roadmap. And you can see a really clear pattern, right? A rule gets made, the financial world gets more complicated, so the rule gets an update. Then a crisis hits, and the rule gets a massive overhaul. It's this constant cycle of action and reaction.
Now, before we go any further, we have to talk about the single most important idea here, capital. This isn't the money you deposit. This is the bank's own money, its own skin in the game. The best way to think about it is like the shock absorbers on your car. It's a financial cushion that's there to soak up the bumps and unexpected losses, so the whole thing doesn't just crash and burn.
And this brings us to the genius of Basel I. It was brilliantly simple. It set one single clear number, 8%. For every dollar of risky stuff a bank had, it needed to have at least 8 cents of its own capital set aside as a buffer. For a super complex world, it was a beautifully straightforward one-size-fits-all solution. But as you can guess, by the early 2000s, finance had become way more complex. That simple one-size-fits-all rule just wasn't cutting it anymore. So regulators went back to the drawing board to build something a whole lot smarter. And that was Basel II.
Now, instead of just one rule, Basel II created this three-pillar system. Pillar 1 was basically an upgraded, more sophisticated version of that old capital rule. But pillars 2 and 3, they were totally new. They brought in direct oversight from regulators, and really importantly, the discipline that comes from forcing banks to be transparent with the public. It was a huge philosophical shift.
This quote really nails the change. The supervisory review process, or SREP, was the engine of that second pillar. For the very first time, regulators weren't just checking the math at the end. They had to actually look under the hood at how a bank managed its risks day to day. It's kind of like a coach reviewing the game film, not just looking at the final score.
And then, 2008 happened. The collapse of Lehman Brothers kicked off what we now call the Great Financial Crisis. It was the ultimate, most brutal stress test you could imagine for the Basel II rules. And boy, did it reveal some terrifying weaknesses.
So here's the crazy thing. A lot of banks technically had enough capital according to the rules. But when the crisis really hit, that capital just wasn't able to absorb the massive losses. It was an incredibly painful lesson that not all capital is created equal. The quality of the shock absorbers mattered way more than anyone had realized. This realization led directly to Basel III, which was a complete overhaul. The focus shifted dramatically to the absolute highest quality, most loss-absorbing capital there is, something called Common Equity Tier 1, or CET1. Think of it as a bank's core funds, stuff that doesn't need to be paid back. It was like upgrading from a simple bicycle helmet to a full-face racing helmet. Yeah, this wasn't just a simple patch. It was a total redesign. Basel III brought in brand new defenses. For example, it required banks to have enough cash to survive a 30-day panic. That's the liquidity coverage ratio.
It also added a simple leverage ratio as a backstop and made stressful what-if scenarios, what we call stress tests, mandatory. Every single one of these tools was designed to fix a specific failure we saw in 2008.
And that brings us to today. The last big pieces of those post-crisis reforms are being put into place, a package people call the Basel Endgame. But just as that's happening, the very nature of risk itself is starting to change all over again.
A huge goal of this endgame is to fix a big problem that came out of Basel II. See, banks were allowed to use their own super complex internal models to figure out how risky they were. That created huge differences between banks. So the new rules basically say you can't grade your own homework too generously. They put a floor on the results to make things more consistent.
But here's the twist in the story. The financial world never, ever stands still. The biggest risks that regulators are worried about now aren't just about bad loans or market crashes. They're grappling with entirely new kinds of threats to the system.
Yup, I'm talking about ESG risks. This is all about the potential financial damage from things like climate change. I mean, think about hurricanes wiping out coastal property values, or social issues like major supply chain disruptions. These are no longer abstract worries. They're seen as real, concrete threats to a bank's bottom line.
And this isn't just talk. It's already becoming policy. You've got major regulatory bodies like the EU actively creating plans to steer money away from high-risk areas and toward more sustainable investments. They're trying to get out ahead of these huge, slow-moving crises.
And here's where our story comes full circle. Remember that SREP from Basel II, the tool that lets regulators look under the hood? Well, European regulators are now using that exact same process to check if banks are ready for these new climate-related risks. It's a perfect example of how this rulebook is constantly adapting.
Which, of course, leaves us with one last massive question. The rulebook has always been fantastic at evolving to fight the last war. But today's risks, from climate change to cyber threats, are nothing like what we've seen before. Is the system we've so carefully built strong enough, and more importantly, forward-looking enough, to handle the next crisis?